Thank you, Mr. Ghosn, for joining us today. So I want to start off, if you don't mind, with a little bit of bragging about my Bloomberg colleagues. We produced a story earlier this year that you were kind enough to work with us on. You allowed us to follow you around the world, to see you leading the three companies that you oversee, Renault in France, Nissan and Mitsubishi Motors in Japan. And the headline of this article was, "If Davos were a person, it would be Carlos Ghosn." There are reasons to profile Mr. Ghosn many times throughout his career, but this was a particularly interesting time. We were witnessing the rise of this trend in which globalization was giving way to nationalism. Donald Trump here was pursuing a America First agenda. In the UK, we were navigating our way through Brexit, continued to. And in France, where Renault is based, obviously, we had the election where Emmanuel Macron prevailed over Marine Le Pen. You rightfully call yourself a citizen of the world. So I'd like to start off, if we could, talking a little bit about heading into 2018, leading this alliance. How do you go about leading these companies and steering them through these times that are so polarized, where there are serious attempts to close borders, to preserve jobs, and to protect plants and the products that they make?
Yeah. Well, we in my industry, which is the car industry, you have to keep an eye on the long-term trends and at the same time watch very carefully what's going on short term. And you may have divergence between what the long terms are and what's going on the short term. And this is a time like this. I have absolutely no doubt on the fact that on the long term, we're going to continue to see an evolution and the development of globalization. I don't think anything going to stop it, because this is the history of humankind. I mean, when you look at our history, not only our economic history, but all our development, we're going towards more and more putting things in common, collaboration, globalization. So we're going to continue, when we invest for the long term, to follow this trend. Now, on the short term, you may have hiccups. And the hiccups are coming from the fact that probably some excesses of globalization have not been corrected. There is misinterpretation about some things that people feel badly about, and they attribute to globalization. The people benefiting from globalization are not recognizing that the benefit of globalization are visible to them. So there is a little bit of marketing of globalization to be done, particularly by large companies, but also by people benefiting from globalization. But also there are some lessons that globalization contains some excesses that needs to be dealt with. So I see more this as short-term hiccups, that when I say short-term at the level of company, we're talking about 2 to 3 years, that in my opinion absolutely do not contradict the fact that globalization is here to stay. It's going to change, it's going to modernize, it's going to adapt. But there is no way you're going to put back the economy behind borders and you're going to build walls, because frankly, this is not the way history is going. And this is certainly not the way wealth can be created and people can benefit.
What about some of those excesses, if we could boil down a little bit? What does need to be corrected? And you talked maybe a little bit about correcting some misinterpretations. Do we need make globalization great again hats? What do we need to do to?
No, I think that there is an explanation. There is a confusion about the fact that some jobs are being threatened somewhere because of globalization. Okay, well, in fact, when you analyze why jobs are being threatened, it's not coming so much from globalization, but it's mainly coming from evolution of technologies. And when you look at the benefit of globalization, globalization today translating by what? By the emergence of China, emergence of India, the development of Russia, the development of South America, the development of North Africa, before seeing the development of Africa. That's what globalization is leading to. You have a lot of benefits for countries which are not immediately benefiting from it, through sales of technology, support to the development of these countries, enrichment. But also it means that through the technology, a lot of jobs are being destroyed. So in a certain way, if you want to take a shortcut, you say globalization is responsible of the destruction of the jobs. Well, I'm not sure, because this job would not even have existed if there was no globalization. And second, most of these destructions are not due to the globalization itself, but of the development of the technology, which is stimulated by globalization. So I think we need to, just to make sure, because at the end of the day, the economy is about facts and about being pragmatic, we need to make sure that we don't confuse the causes and the effects, and we try to have a clear analysis, and we as entrepreneurs need to do that, because at the end of the day, what we want is to have this growth of the global economy to continue. And we don't want to have false remedies that are going to handicap the economies of everybody. Nobody's going to be, frankly, beneficiary from closing the walls and putting handicaps in front of the free flow of products and of technologies. And we need to fight against that, because at the end of the day, we think that it's counterproductive for not only the global economy, but every single economy inside the global economy.
As long as we're talking about globalization, we might as well talk about sort of the global makeup of the auto industry. You accumulated some additional scale last year with the Renault-Nissan alliance, adding Mitsubishi Motors to the group, and that's put you in a position to where the alliance is now contending for leadership in this industry from a sales perspective. There's been a bit of a heavy is the head that wears the crown phenomenon in our industry, where we've seen General Motors obviously go through some troubles, Toyota and Volkswagen as well, along the way to reaching that position. How do you go about sort of leading these companies to avoid the pitfalls of scale turning against you? And was that what happened to some of your competitors?
Yeah. Well, look, from a business point of view, being number 2, number 3, or number 3 is not going to make any difference, particularly when the difference between 1, 2, and 3 is so minimal.
Right.
Okay? So when you're selling 10.5 million cars and you're number 1, and the number 2 sells 10.4 million, or number 3 sells 10.3 million, from a business point of view, it's not different. It's not different. So that's why we don't consider it as an objective by itself, and we never consider it as an objective, because at the end of the day, we are business people, and what we want is looking for a position that's going to give us an advantage. So scale is important, because scale in our industry gives you an advantage if you use it smartly. You know, by using common platforms, standardization, negotiating well with your suppliers, you're going to get a competitive edge, particularly in terms of cost and in terms of pricing. That's what is important. But scale is not going to be impacted by a difference of 50,000 cars or 100,000 cars a year. It's going to be impacted by a difference of 3 million or 4 million cars a year. So what we are saying is we want to make sure that with our scale, we have handicap to nobody, and we have advantage on practically everybody, and that's where we are today. But being number 1 or number 2 when the difference is minimal, from a business point of view, doesn't make any difference. Obviously, from a PR point of view, well, it makes a big difference. Using the example of the runners of 100 meter, there is no difference really between the one who is the gold medal and the one who is silver medal. It's a difference of 1/10 of a second. So frankly, they are as fast one as the other. You can barely see it. But in terms of image, while the number 1 gets all the attention and everybody paying this attention. And for us, what does it mean? It means that people looking for a partner want to also partner with the number 1. People who want to sell a new technology, they're going to go to the largest car manufacturer. People want to establish a partnership to develop, some particular, device about autonomous cars or connectivity, are going to go for the largest car manufacturer. So you have a kind of image advantage, but not meaningful in terms of business. That's why we don't consider it as an objective, but we are pleased, because in a certain way, it gives us some indirect advantages.
One of the members of the alliance has run into some issues that's costed some production in Japan recently, a quality inspection issue. Is that going to cost you the gold or determine the gold or silver this year?
Again, at the end of the day, this is a competition, and the competition is the result of a full year with some advantages, some inconvenience, some handicaps. Your competition are submitted to the same thing. And what's important is what's the bottom line of all of this. what matters for me is not so much, that at a certain point in time you're number one, number two, number three, but what is the dynamic of your companies? But what is important is that the three companies constituting the alliance, Nissan, Renault, and Mitsubishi, have a dynamic of growth, which is based on new products, new technologies, which are very modern technology. We're talking about electric cars, we're talking about autonomous cars, we're talking about connected cars and mobility services, on top of being very competitive on the traditional business. That's what matters. Even if you miss the crown in 2017, which I doubt, but if you miss it, well, you're going to be there in 2018, and then you're going to be there in 2019 because you have a program of growth which is based on a geographical growth and also on technological growth.
And you've been an outspoken champion of scale, and I think you just alluded to this as a means to bringing down the costs of technology like autonomy and electrification. You acquired Mitsubishi, as we mentioned. Going forward, will the alliance continue to be a consolidator of sorts of the industry, or is your dinner table getting a little bit full?
No, not at all. That means the logic of the alliance is to make sure that different car makers with different brands, different strategies, different cultures, different background, different histories can collaborate together in order to commonize things which in a certain way are not relevant for the consumer. When we have common platform and derive from a common platform different cars, it's fine. If you're using common powertrains, well, frankly, people don't care too much about what kind of powertrain they have in their engine. What they care about is what is the fuel efficiency and what is the cost of the car. So the whole logic of the alliance is to make sure that you are developing synergies between different car makers, synergies that are giving you an advantage for each one of the participants of this alliance. But at the same time, you have a differentiated offer on the market. Mitsubishi is very different from Nissan. Renault is different from Nissan. When we started the alliance in 1999, a lot of people said, "Oh my God, that you're going to have cannibalization between Renault and Nissan, particularly in markets where the two brands are present." Obviously, you don't see it in the United States because Renault is not present in the United States. But the two brands are present in Europe and very heavily present in Europe. There's absolutely not cannibalization between the two brands. After 17 years, even though there is a lot of things which have been shared between the two companies. Why? Because again, same thing, scale, you have to use it smartly. If you use it smartly, it will give you a lot of advantages. And at the same time, so you have the efficiency of one company, but at the same time, the agility of different companies going their own way.
We had a chart up just a moment ago showing some of the M&A activity within our industry. And one of the biggest ones that in our industry this year was involved General Motors and Peugeot. I think the buyer in that transaction seems very much to be in a position that you're in of believing in scale. It appeared that the seller was actually maybe sort of stepping away from that position. Do you have any expectation of whether we're going to see more of any one or the other? Because it does appear that some companies are being rewarded for looking at spinning off operations and divesting some businesses as well.
Well, objectively, scale helps you. Objectively. Nobody tries to be smaller, usually. Everybody tries to grow. That's the logic of a company. You try to grow by your own growth, or you try to grow by acquiring other companies. This is the instinct of every company, because we know that growth makes you usually more competitive if it's managed well. Now, it's not always easy, particularly when growth is coming through mergers. And we know there have been a lot of failures in the car industry through this. So I understand that, even though the strategy is very clear, it's difficult. And because it's difficult from time to time, it contains pitfalls and it can lead to decline. So I can understand that some companies saying, okay, I've not been profitable in the market, so I'm going to selling my operation. Others going to say, no, scale is important. I know how to be profitable in this market. I'm going to buy this operation. So these two logical are not contradictory. They are just reflecting about what management at a certain point in time think is feasible or not feasible. So, but objectively, the reality is in the performance of each company. Okay, so when we signed the alliance in 1999, there was a lot of skepticism about how can you make these two companies not merge and working together, how this is going to work. Well, you can't answer academically to this. People are going to say, okay, let's wait and see. 17 years later, we're there, and we are in much better shape than we were by ourselves. And we are in much better shape than every single merger that happened in the industry during this period of time. That's, for me, the demonstration of the fact that this can be very efficient. It doesn't mean that every alliance is going to be successful, because it's not only about strategy, but it's also particularly, it's the execution of the strategy that makes it successful or not. You know very well that 5% is the selection of the strategy, 95% is the execution of the strategy. If the execution is not good, you can't just say the strategy is not good. You don't know. Maybe the execution is bad and the strategy is very good. But a good strategy which is not followed but a thorough execution is not going to lead to any results. I am convinced, based on my experience, I cannot talk for others, that alliances are a great way for companies to work together in an efficient way, particularly in the world we are, where you facing globalization, multiplication of the market, disruptions in technologies. You don't want to have a uniform approach to the market. You want to have different approach to the market, leave each company with its own energy, with its own strategy, but at the same time, avoiding duplication and avoiding waste. And this is where alliances play a role. So yes, we can be a consolidator of the industry. We can be a platform for many companies who want to share a technology they cannot afford to develop by themselves. But this is not mandatory. This is more opportunistic.
One of those disruptive technologies that you just mentioned, obviously, has been electrification. And you were an early proponent of electric vehicles with the Nissan Leaf that debuted about 7 years ago, if I have that right. A new one coming out, and a number of other vehicles hitting the market at the moment. The Tesla Model 3, I think the Chevy Bolt is starting to gain some steam. What's your outlook for how the electric vehicle market is going to take shape globally? And is it going to match the expectations that maybe we see some of the biggest advocates for this technology talk about?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're going to see more and more electric cars coming. And I think this is also a trend which is obvious. And this is not a trend which is driven by consumers. This is a trend which is driven by regulation. And these regulations are mainly about climate change and about CO2 limitation. There is absolute, and this is not only in the United States, Europe, China, Japan, everybody's getting there. There is no way that car makers can reach the limitation which are being scheduled by the different countries without electric car, which means without zero emission vehicles. It's impossible. I mean, you make your calculation, you see what the Chinese are, forecasting for CAFE, the CAFE in the United States, even though there have been some kind of reduction of the toughness in the US, in our opinion, it's a parenthesis. It's not a trend. And in Europe, it's becoming tougher and tougher, and the Europeans are even advancing some of the limitation. No way the industry is going to be able to continue to prosper without a sizable amount of electric cars. Not driven by the consumer, because at the end of the day, the consumer doesn't care if the engine, if is a motor, is electric, is diesel, or is a gasoline. He cares about the price, the reliability, the cost of ownership, the resale value, and the regulation is going to probably, in a certain way, push one technology compared to the other. I'm going to give you one example. Why in Europe 50% of the market for passenger car is made of diesel engines, while in the United States it's practically zero, and in Japan it's practically zero? What's the difference? They are the same car makers, by the way. They are the same in Europe, in the United States, and in Japan. The only difference is the regulation. That means in Europe, there have been an incentive for diesel. There have been many rules allowing diesel to have an advantage, and the consumer bought diesel cars. I mean, people buy diesel engine if they live in Europe, and if they come to the United States, they're going to buy a gasoline engine, and if they go to Japan, they're going to buy a hybrid. This is part of the local set of regulation. Electric cars are going to be particularly developed because of the incentive put by different governments towards lowering the emission. And I can tell you that the Chinese are probably the most aggressive into this direction. And even they are taking goals in terms of number of electric cars to be sold by car makers. And we're not talking about 2030 or 2040 here. We're talking about particularly horizons which are not very far away. On top of this, when the consumer listened to the mayor of Paris saying there will be no more diesel engine allowed in downtown Paris in 2024, when the Minister of Environment of this country tell you there will be no more internal combustion engine allowed in 2030, well, the consumer is going to be buying a car, and for him it's an important investment. He's going to say, wait a minute, I'm not going to go and buy a gasoline car and a diesel engine if I can buy an electric car and be safe, particularly for the resale value. All of this is playing towards the development of electric cars. Car makers understand that. 7 years ago, we were the first one to move toward mass marketing of electric cars. Now there is hardly one car maker who is not having an offer of electric cars, and you're going to see the multiplication of the electric car offer through all the segments. I mean, today you see it in passenger cars, premium cars, but you're going to start to see it in SUVs and crossover, pickup trucks, etc.
So do you wince or welcome when those public officials talk about an internal combustion engine ban sometime in the future? I guess is one question. And second, is our market here doomed if we do away with tax credits for electric vehicles?
Well, I think, first, obviously, as we have been the first one to invest for mass marketing of electric cars, and we have seen this coming, in a certain way, we're happy because we said, okay, we've seen it coming, we're going to have an advantage. Okay, but for years, we have invested on electric cars, and the sales were very low, so we took it on our margins. Now we should have an advantage, so in a certain way, we're happy because our investment made a lot of sense, and we have been seeing this coming. Obviously, at the beginning, at the first phase of development of electric car, you need incentive from governments. Chinese government putting an incentive for electric cars, French government putting an incentive, UK government putting an incentive, United States, you have an incentive in and out, depending on the state. There are questions about what's going to happen at the level of the country. Well, this is going to accelerate or slow down the development of electric car. In my opinion, is absolutely not going to change the trend toward electric car. For a very simple reason is, the limitation of CO2 and climate change is not going to disappear. It's going to be here. And the constraints on the industry are going to continue to be here. And we, all the car makers are global. That means I cannot develop an engine for one country. I have to develop an engine and technology for the planet. So when I see how the Chinese are pushing towards limitation of CO2, or Europeans, or the Japanese, that means obviously I need to develop this technology, and this technology are going to be available for all the other countries.
We talked a little bit, just alluded to autonomy, and there's headlines daily on the Bloomberg and elsewhere about the rise of these mobility services. You gave a very interesting answer to us a couple years back about the rise of these trends that you're not necessarily inclined to go along, that your bet is to make your cars attractive and connected so that we get to a point where it's a lot like your iPhone. You're not going to be willing to share that or lend that out to somebody else. The same will apply to your car. Have your views evolved in that sense at all in the years that have followed, and how are you thinking about those services now?
I mean, a lot of people think that this is substitution. It's not. It's addition. You have the traditional car business that, by the way, continue to grow, even though young people in mature market are buying less and less cars, even though there is Uber and more shared car, etc. Still, the traditional business of the car industry continue to grow. I mean, 2017 is going to be another record year for the car industry. Obviously, the growth is mainly supported by the growth in China, the growth in India, the recovery of the Russian market, the recovery of the Brazilian market, the growth taking place in some countries in Africa, North Africa particularly. So obviously, Europe is stabilizing, United States is stabilizing, Japan is stabilizing. So the traditional business of building cars and selling cars and owning cars is going to continue. I don't think it's going to stop. And why is it going to continue? Because you have in the United States about 800 cars per 1,000 residents. In China, you're still at maybe 150 cars per 1,000 residents. You have 20 cars per 1,000 residents in India. You have 30 cars per 1,000 residents in Indonesia, which is another very heavily populated. I'm not going to talk about Africa, which is even lower numbers. I mean, the growth is going to be here because the first thing people aspire to is to have an autonomous way of transportation. Because autonomous way of transportation gives you access to education, gives you access to jobs, gives you access to a lot of things. So this is going to continue. Maybe not into the very developed countries, but certainly in the emerging market, which is going to sustain this part. Now, aside this, you're going to have the new business develop around the car, which is shared cars, hail services, mobility services, etc. So for me, it's an additional business. It's not a substitution. It will have an impact on the normal car business, but in my opinion, it's going to be marginal. And we, as car manufacturers, we have to pay attention to the traditional business of doing cars, but at the same time prepare for the new businesses that are going to develop through connectivity, autonomy, and mobility services.
It's a fascinating discussion. Thank you for having it with us. Ladies and
Thank you.
gentlemen, Carlos Ghosn.
Thank you. I lost my...
Thank you.